Hey class, in this video we're going to continue working with Photoshop. We are going to learn a few special effects and different ways that we can blend our two images together. So in the last video we learned how to composite two images together using a mask to mask out the background of one image and add it into the second image. And today what we're going to do is look at some different filters and some different special effects that we can do to kind of blend those images together, make them look like they come from the same source. We're going to look at a couple different techniques that we can use to do that. So let's go over here and let's just look at what we're going to be working on today. So Photoshop, filters, blending, and adjustments. Those are kind of the main topics that we're going to look at. So we'll actually talk about blending first. Then we will talk about filters and adjustments. And I think that's everything. I'm going to show a couple different examples of this. We're going to look at both realistic and non-realistic or stylized filters. And I'll go over a couple things. I saw something kind of interesting actually on a YouTube video last night that I'm going to try to recreate, but I'll kind of talk about different ways that we can do a few different things to kind of get some different effects and different styles in our project. So let's go ahead over to Photoshop and get started. So here's my self-portrait.psd. It's when I open Photoshop, it'll kind of show me some files that I've been working on recently. But if you don't see that, you can also go to your Finder. So if I open up the Finder, let's bring this folder down here. In my MMP 100 folder, I should have this self-portrait folder. And I can go here to self-portrait.psd and just double click that, and that'll open it up the same way. So let's go into Photoshop. And so just to quickly review a little bit, we've got a few layers over here. We've got our main image, which is this pigeon that is looking at the New York city skyline. So we can turn that on and off. There we go. Then I have a copy of this lizard image, but I just use that copy there kind of as a backup. And then I remove the background from the lizard. I've created this mask, which we can double click and see here. So the red is everything that we took out of that image. And so we just have the lizard there. So what we're going to work on today is using the blending modes in our layers and doing some filtering and some adjustments to kind of make these two images look more similar. And so before we get into that, let's just take a look at what we're going to be looking at. So if I zoom in a little bit here, we can see our lizard is much more brightly lit. There's a lot more color information in the lizard, and it doesn't really look, even though we've managed to remove the background and make it look like the lizard is inside of our scene, it still kind of stands out, not just because it's a lizard. That's kind of what we want, is this sort of like kind of interesting juxtaposition. But what's different, what makes it stand out in a way that we don't want, is that it's very bright. The way it's lit is very bright. And that has to do with, the source lighting and other things related to when these two photographs were first taken. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try some basic adjustments to the data in this image. Remember that the image is really ultimately made up of lots of little pixels. And so when we add filters and adjustments and things like that, what we're really doing is we're just applying some, relatively complex math to each one of the colors in these pixels. We don't actually have to do the math ourselves. That's what Photoshop is for. But that's what we are going to be doing. So one thing real quick before we get into that, actually, I'm kind of noticing when I zoom in that you can kind of see this contour, this like little line here between the lizard and the background. And that might not look great as we start to add some more adjustments here. So one thing that I think I forgot to cover in the last video is that we can actually blend this out a little bit if we edit our mask. there's a setting in our mask right here called feather. And what that does is going to kind of blend between the part that's masked out and the part that we still see. And so if I feather this out, you see we get this kind of nice blend. And then once I do that, if I kind of do this in a more extreme way, you see that it starts to blend out the whole thing. So I don't want to feather too much, but once I do feather a little bit, I'm going to shift the edge in. And so what this does is it kind of shifts the edge of our mask towards the center. And so I'm just going to shift the edge in a tiny bit and feather just a tiny bit. And you notice those numbers are very small. I'm feathering like 0.5 pixels, and I'm shifting the edge. I'll even do a little bit less than that. I'll do like negative 40%. So that's going to shift in. And if I hit OK there, now that outline is gone. We still see it a little bit right here, but it's not that noticeable. So you can play around with that. You know, again, I'm not going to get it 100% perfect, but let's just feather a little bit more. Shift the edge in just a little bit. You can see that edge kind of cutting in. We don't want to go too far because then we start to lose some of the detail of the lizard. But let's just shift it in just a little bit more, and that looks pretty good. Again, you could play around with that more. I'm gonna move on for the sake of the demo. Okay, so now I'm hitting V on the keyboard just to come back to my move tool, and I'm gonna hit Command 1 to zoom out a little bit. And then actually let's zoom back into the lizard a little bit. And so let's see what we can do to make this lizard look a little more similar to the lighting in our background image. And it doesn't have to look perfect, but we just want to kind of match it a little bit more similar. So one thing that I'll kind of mention before we do that is there's a couple different ways that we can add adjustments. So one, if we imagine our layers, we have like a bunch of layers. We have our background, and then we have this layer with our lizard. So we can add filters and adjustments just to a layer. So that just changes the color of the layer itself. That's called a layer adjustment or a layer filter or blend, whatever one we're applying. But we can also, and what we will do a little bit, is we can add a layer on top that's an adjustment layer. And so what that does is it applies a filter or a change to everything below it. And so we'll look at using both of those different types of adjustments. So the first thing we'll do is look at a couple of very simple things we can do to change the blending. So if we look at this layer of my lizard, there's a property called opacity. This is how see-through it is. And you can notice if I move this down, my lizard becomes kind of transparent. That's not really useful for an opaque object like a lizard, but if you had some smoke or some clouds or some water composited into your scene, you might want to use some opacity. Or maybe if the lizard is supposed to be, you know, the ghost of our pigeon's friend or something like that, we could do some opacity like that, so we'd have a little see-through. But for this case, we don't really need that. So that's one way that we can kind of blend our layers together. Another thing that we can do is there's actually these different sort of blending modes, and these can be useful. I'll probably actually use these with some of the adjustment layers that I'm going to add later, but just to kind of show what these look like. If I add these in, you're going to see what it does is it actually looks at what's behind these pixels, and then it applies different math to kind of combine the pixels together. So if I do lighten, it takes the lighter of the two pixels. If I do screen, it does a kind of similar but slightly different version of that. If I do an overlay, it's going to kind of take different amounts of color from different pixels. If I do soft light, it's going to do a similar thing, except it's not going to take the darkest or the lightest pixels. So there's kind of like different things here. Some of them are basic math. So for example, if I do difference, I get these kind of weird colors because it's subtracting the two colors from each other. If I do divide, I get really bright colors because it's dividing the colors by each other. And so there's different stuff in here. We're not going to use these right now. We're going to come back to this in a second, but those are just kind of the two things that are already available in our layer panel. Okay, so what we're going to do is add some adjustments to this layer. So if I want to add an adjustment, there's a couple different ways to do it. One is I can go into image and I can go to adjustments and I can look at all these adjustments here. Okay, another thing that I can do is just click down here And it's going to give me some options down here as well in this little sort of half moon sort of black and white cookie filter thing here. So if I want to apply just to the layer itself, then I can go to image, I can go to adjustments, and you can see there's a bunch of different adjustments. These all do different things. We don't have time to go over every single one, but I'll show you a couple that I use the most often. So one is just levels. This has a key command, so you can get this by just hitting Command L. And so that kind of indicates that it's a pretty popular technique. So I'm going to click L there. And this kind of shows us all the colors that we have. And then I can move these sliders to sort of weight it towards one color or another. So that's useful. I can also change the overall output so it favors brighter colors or darker colors. I can do that. I can also go into specific color channels where I only affect the red. So you can see I'm leaning away from red or leaning towards red by adjusting these. And there's 3 points. There's the kind of the brightest of the reds, there's kind of the darkest of the reds over here, and then there's kind of the midtones here. So we can get some very, very specific adjustments this way. However, if you're not really, well versed in color theory, you might have some troubles here. There are some presets which are always a useful place to start. So for example, one thing that I might want to say is the lizard seems to have much brighter lighting than the background. So if I use the darker preset, and then I can say, does that really look good? Maybe I need to take out some highlights. Let's go back to my RGB channel. And let's see. Let's take out some of the highlights. So even just this very slight adjustment, like see, I've barely changed this, but I set the darker preset and now I'm taking out a few highlights and it actually already starts to look a lot better because the image, the original image is so much brighter than the background image. So I'm gonna hit OK there. And the nice thing about using a filter like this on the image is we can turn that on and off very easily to see what it looks like without the filter. There it is with the filter. And then we can, if we have multiple filters, we can turn them on here. And then there's a little adjustment icon here. If I double click this, it'll bring me up here and I can adjust there. So this is very nice because I can kind of preview it. If I decide I don't really want this, but I want to leave it there in case I want it later, I can just turn that off. So I'm going to actually turn off levels for a second and let's look at one more adjustment. I'm going to go to adjustments again, and you can see there's a whole bunch of these. A lot of them are really useful. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go over all of them, but let's look at the exposure adjustment. So this has to do with sort of recreating the exposure that happens in a digital camera when it's sensing light. And so if we increase the exposure here, we're going to get more light. If we decrease the exposure, we're going to get a darker. And again, this is another way to make the image a little bit darker, but apply it across the image. So this is not looking as good to me, so I'll probably go back to the levels, but let's see if we can play around with the adjustment. Actually, if I offset this a little, gamma correction is color correction. So if we correct for color, we're going to get brighter or darker. And then we can also see some defaults here. If you're not, super familiar with digital photography, these might not make that much sense to you. That's okay. That's not really the sort of goal of the class. So I'm just going to lower the exposure just a little bit and then offset it a little bit as well. And that actually looks pretty similar to our levels adjustment. I'm going to click OK, and then we can compare those. So there's my exposure adjustment. There's my levels adjustment. Pretty similar. If I do both of them, it's a little bit too dark. So I'm going to stick with my levels. I kind of like that better. Let's zoom out a little bit. So I'm going to hit Control-1 or Command-1, and I'm going to hold the space bar so I can move this around. And I think that looks decent. Let's look at the exposure one again. The exposure one I think is a little too obvious, so I'm going to get rid of that. Okay, so that is how we can apply some filters or adjustments to a single layer. Now we're going to look at applying an adjustment to the entire image by using an adjustment layer. So again, you may want to play around with this a little bit. This has to do, if we go back to a second, what I was talking about before, realistic versus non-realistic or stylized rendering. So if we want to do something realistic, we want to match the colors and sort of brightness of the image without really changing the overall look of the image, since we started with these photos. As we start to add more filters and blending techniques and things like that, we're going to move into the non-realistic or stylized realm. And in some ways that's easier, because if we apply a non-realistic filter to the whole image, it's going to be a lot harder to see the differences between the two source images. But now you have a stylized images, so it might not be appropriate for every context. So it kind of depends on what you're going for. But let's go back and look at a couple different filters, adjustment layers, and then I'll talk about this setup that I saw in a video pretty recently, and I'll see if I can recreate it, and I'll link to that video as well. So that'll be a good example of, like, there's a lot of really cool creators on YouTube and other platforms that actually work with these products and do design and retouching and things like that, and they'll often put up tutorials just to kind of show you how to do something for fun. And so that's actually where I get a lot of inspiration for different ideas from. Okay, so if I want to add an entire layer, there's a few ways to do that, but I can click on my little black and white cookie down here, and I can add a layer. And I'm going to add a layer that makes it very clear what's going on. So I'm going to add a Posterize layer. And that's going to bring up this other window. And I can basically posterize this image. What Posterize does is it kind of limits the number of colors that an image uses. And so you can see if I reduce it down to 2 colors, it's going to be, very few colors. If I the more colors I get, the closer we get back to the original image. And so this is a useful thing to use if we want to kind of simplify the amount of color data, and then we can kind of simplify the image a little bit. So we're going to use this. I'm going to stick with 2 levels for now, but I'm going to turn this off and show another adjustment. And eventually we're going to kind of build a few adjustments together. So it'll be kind of interesting. Okay, let's look at another adjustment. I'm going to do black and white because we're going to use these all together in a bit. So now we have black and white, and this basically just converts the image to black and white. So we can mask this if we want to, but we're just going to keep it simple for a second. We can kind of like move these colors around in terms of what qualifies as various colors, or we can just use auto to kind of detect. And so it's going through and it's basically just converting the color to what it would be, sort of how bright it is, and converting that to a grayscale color. So that looks pretty cool. And now look what's going to happen. One thing I want to demonstrate is that the order of these adjustments is important. So if I do posterize and then I do black and white, I get this kind of, there's a lot of detail still here, but I have this little floating window. Let's get rid of that. There's a lot of detail still here, but it's kind of simplified since we posterize and then black and white. Now look what happens if I switch these. Now notice that there's basically only black and white pixels because we only have 2 levels of color and we're starting out with fewer colors to begin with. So notice my lizard is basically just black and white. So if I wanted to do kind of like a cool retro computer graphics thing, this might be a useful way to do that. But if I want to adjust this, I can click on my posterize. That's the mask, actually. You know what? I don't need these masks, so let's go ahead and delete these. These masks, they just add them just in case you want to use them, but I actually don't want to use them. So since we're not using them, let's go ahead and delete those masks. Now, if I want to adjust this posterize, I can double click and that'll bring up my properties window. And it's just kind of floating around. And so when I change the number of levels, it adds more colors. Let me get rid of this for a second and I'll put this up here. So if I just have 2 levels, I just have black and white. If I go to 3 levels, now I have this kind of mid-gray scale. And then obviously if I go up to 10 levels, I get a lot more color. Okay, so let's put that back at 2 levels. And let's check our black and white settings again. Default. Okay. something happened when I deleted the mask. I wonder if I actually needed that mask. No, there we go. Okay. Oh, you know what? I think I might have been... There we go. Okay. So that's 3, 4. Okay, let's go back to 2. Something strange is happening. Okay, I'm not exactly sure what's happening, but if I use this slider, that works a little bit better. For some reason, when I use the number, some other numbers are getting put in there. Anyway, you got to be a little bit careful. Okay, so that's another filter that we can have. So another thing that we can do is add more data. Something that I often like to add is like a noise filter. And so the next step in this process is I'm going to add a little bit of noise, and I'm going to add 2 different types of noise just to kind of show how you can get different effects with noise. So I'm going to turn these off for a second, and I'm going to add a new layer. So unlike the other adjustments, if we want to add noise, we need some data to add noise on. I'm just going to use the paint bucket. So I'm going to go over here and click on the paint bucket, and I'm going to click on my default colors down here. And I'm just going to fill in a black square. So now, if I want to add some noise, I'm going to add noise here. I'm just going to rename this noise. And I'm going to go to filter. So this is another thing that we can add besides adjustments and blending layers, is we can go into filter and we can actually generate stuff. So if I go into noise, add noise, you can see if I add noise, it kind of just adds lots of random colors. And I can say I want it to be monochromatic, and I can kind of set how much of it I want. I don't want a ton actually, so I'm going to go with like 5%. And then one thing is that the noise is very small, so I'll usually kind of like zoom in a little bit to the noise. So what I'll do is I'll hit Command T to transform, and I'm just going to double the size of the noise. So I'm going to go to 200%. Okay, so it'll be a little bit easier to see that noise, and I'm just going to hit Enter to apply. So that's our first noise. And with this, I'm going to use a blending mode. So for this one, I'm going to use soft light. And you'll see what that kind of looks like is it just kind of adds this kind of like grainy texture on top of the photo. It's already a little grainy, so it's kind of hard to see the difference, but I'm going to also just reduce the opacity. So actually, let's go back to normal, and I'm going to reduce the opacity to like maybe 30%, something like that. And so there you can see that kind of noise that I added. And then I'm going to change the blend mode to soft light. So it doesn't darken the photo too much, but it blends that noise in. Okay, so that's one type of noise. We can also make more fancy noise. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to select my bucket tool, fill this in black. And now I'm going to go to filter. And for this one, I'm going to do a... So for this one, I'm actually going to go to the filter gallery so I can see a little bit more. And I'm going to go under this sketch, and I'm going to use this reticulation. So this is very similar to noise, but notice that it has a little bit more detail. It looks a little bit more sort of natural, like it kind of looks like sand on the beach or waves or something like that, rather than just kind of a bunch of random colors. And I can kind of play around with this. I can increase the density. I can change the level. I can play around with this to get different effects that I want. And there's a bunch of other stuff in here. I really recommend playing around with these different things, but I'm just going to increase this density a bit. We get something kind of like that. And we can always come back and play around with this if we want to. So I'm going to hit OK here. And so now this is our sketch noise. And so notice I'm going to decrease the opacity a little bit, and then I'm going to turn this into a soft light blend. And so notice this gives us a very, very different quality. So the regular noise, it's very subtle. It adds a little bit there, a little bit of texture, but it doesn't do that much. this noise really gives us a very different texture. So we're kind of going away from realism. We're kind of going into this like film grain texture. Okay, so now we're gonna reapply our other layers. So let's bring these guys back in, and let's see what happens if I put this in between the two layers. See what happens here. This is very cool. So now we're setting black and white. This is the cool effect that I saw in the video. We're setting the black and white, then we're adding this noise. So looks what it looks like before the posterize. Now the posterize picks up that noise. So look how much different that looks when I add it before or after. So I would try this with lots of different effects. You can get all these really different, cool, interesting things. And then I can actually control this with the opacity of this layer. So if I turn the opacity down, I get a lot less noise. If I turn it up, I get a lot more noise. So you can really have a lot of control over this and get some cool effects here. And then there's one more step. This is one of my favorite effects. We're gonna add one more adjustment layer, and I'm gonna add a gradient map. The gradient map is awesome. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with this, but it basically is gonna replace our colors, our black and white, with different colors. And then it's very easy to kind of adjust this. So we'll see a couple things we can do. So we have our gradient map here. I'm gonna go ahead and delete that layer mask as well. I'm gonna double click here, and this is the gradient editor. And so you can see with the gradient editor, if we just have black and white, this doesn't really change anything in the image because we just have these two colors. So even when I make these adjustments, nothing really changes. But when I change these colors, so I'm gonna click on this color dropper here, and I'll choose a color. You'll see that that's gonna apply for all the colors in there. So I get this really interesting stylized look. And so let's change the white color. We can get something. We want a little bit of contrast here. Maybe make it a little more pink, or we could go the other direction, make it kind of green. That looks kind of nice. Okay, so we've got these two colors, we've got our gradient map, and now we can do lots of different things with this. We can change the colors, we can do all sorts of stuff, and now we can go back and we can adjust how much noise there is to kind of match this new look. So now, if we go back and look at our lizard and our pigeon, there's really no difference between the two because we've really taken out all of the original sort of lighting and color information from our original photographs. Now we have this much more stylized image that's really kind of specific. Okay, so if we want to make this even more complex, we can add more colors. So the last step here, if we want to add a couple more colors, the number of levels in our posterize just needs to match the number of colors that we want to set up. So posterize reduces the number of colors in the image. So let's set that to 4. Okay, so now we have 4 colors. We've got a lot more detail. See how much more you can do with 4 colors. So that looks nice. And now in our gradient map, it's going to be mapping those 2 colors or the 4 colors to our 2 colors here. But we can add more colors just by clicking here, and we can adjust where these colors apply. So let's add 4 colors, and then we can adjust. So let's change this one. Let's see if we add sort of a darker purple. That's kind of nice for those darker tones. And then in between our purple and our green, depending on what color here, you're going to get a lot of different effects. So if we have colors that are kind of the same, we get more of this blending between the colors. If we have colors that are very different, we get this kind of like very exaggerated highlight effect. So I kind of like that. Get these really bright highlights. So I'll say, okay, here, I'm going to adjust this green a little bit and actually make it darker. There we go. Okay. So this isn't perfect. I could spend a lot of time playing with all of these adjustments and doing different things, but this is getting in the direction where I have something that's kind of interesting, kind of stylized, and I can kind of play with all these different parameters and see, where if I play with the kind of edges of where it adds these colors in, I can kind of make different highlights and get different effects. So there's a lot of little sliders and little buttons that I can play with. So this doesn't have to be your approach. You can, use lots of different approaches. You can use different filters. You can add lots of different images. You might want to stick with a photorealistic approach. You might not like the noise look, so you might want to just take out the noise altogether, take out the posterize altogether. You can kind of play around with all of these different effects and how they add together and come up with something, you know, that expresses the idea behind your project. So I'm gonna stop there. This week we're gonna do some more Photoshop work to kind of wrap up this part of our self-portrait, but we're also gonna be learning Illustrator. So I'm gonna go over some basic techniques in Illustrator in the second video. For this week, we are not going to, our assignment is not due yet, so we're gonna do another weekly blog post, and I'll probably make a quick video or tag that on at the end of the Illustrator video. So let's go ahead and export this image so we can just kind of show our progress, and then we'll post everything in the next video. So I'm gonna go to File and go to Export and Export As. And again, this isn't the final image. This is just, you know, our next step. Although for me, this is probably the last Photoshop tutorial I'm gonna do. As I've mentioned a couple times, this is really, you know, we're gonna do really quick snapshots of the software. There's obviously a million tools and different things you can do with Photoshop that we haven't covered yet. And I encourage you to seek those things out. If you have ideas for things that you want to do that I haven't covered, let me know and we could talk about where you might find those things. But there are also a million tutorials on YouTube and the Photoshop Adobe website and other places where you can find these things. So this is a little bit larger. Let's turn the quality down just a bit. Okay, so we get 200 kilobytes. That looks good. I'm gonna click export. And so I'm just gonna put a 2 at the end of this just to indicate that this is the second version of the Photoshop self-portrait that I've made. And in the next video, I'm gonna go over Illustrator a little bit, and then I'll post this at the end.